The Mark 18 torpedo suddenly lurched hard to starboard. The veteran sonar man recognized the change in pitch immediately. His voice cracked with horror as he shouted a desperate warning, "She's done a runaround!" Commander Richard O'Kane ordered an immediate course correction and full power to the engines, but there was no avoiding their fate. A faulty gyroscope had swung the Mark 18 around in its firing path, putting it into a looping trajectory and straight on course with the American submarine that had just fired it. O'Kane and his men stood paralyzed, their breaths caught in their throats as the Mark 18 closed the distance. Each second stretched into an eternity, the submarine's crew bracing for the impending collision. 2 hours earlier, 0030 local, October 25, 1944, Commander Richard O'Kane peered through the binoculars from the bridge of the USS Tang, to date the most successful American submarine of World War II. The deeds of the Tang were already the stuff of legend, having conducted several war patrols already and sinking more Japanese ships than a dozen other submarines combined. In just one patrol, she sank more tonnage than the Japanese were able to build in a month. Commander O'Kane was one of America's undersea aces, a hero of the U.S. Navy known for his daring raids deep in enemy-controlled waters. Just a month ago, he had taken the Tang into the Formosa Strait, waters that would after the war be known as the Strait of Taiwan. But these waters are so shallow that any submarine operating in them was asking to be sunk. Only a madman would dare raid into this heavily defended stretch of sea. But the strait was a vital waterway for the Japanese, with the majority of the ore, fuel, and rubber resource that the Japanese needed to continue the war effort crossing through it. This made it a dangerous but target-rich environment, and O'Kane had delivered a crippling blow to the Japanese, sinking 4 ships in one raid alone. He had to run away at flank speed from an enemy destroyer, but the attack had been well worth it. Now he was looking for new prey just north of the strait, and he'd brought the Tang into deeper waters where he felt a bit more comfortable. Scanning around for signs of enemy activity, he decided the coast was clear. It was just past midnight and the Tang would have the cover of darkness. The Tang could cruise for hours at depth, but she was fastest on the surface, and he needed to move quickly to make full use of the cover of darkness. Somewhere up ahead was Turnabout Island, signaling the mouth of the strait and sitting outside the Japanese-occupied port city of Fuzhou. Japanese merchant vessels laden with iron ore and coal regularly steamed past here, hugging the Chinese coast for protection from marauding American submarines. Only operable on the surface, the submarine's surface search radar powered on, showing no returns. O'Kane ordered the boat steady ahead. On her deck, 2 sailors, grateful for the fresh air, huddled against the freezing wind and scanned the horizon for enemy aircraft. It would take a miracle for an enemy patrol to spot them at night, but if they did, they could pounce on the Tang before she could make for the safety of the depths. 130 hours local. An hour passed. Turnabout Island was somewhere out there, lurking in the darkness. The crew worked to their positions silently and diligently. An almost palpable electricity coursed through the submarine, a shared understanding that this was the most perilous game O'Kane had ever played. But every American submariner on board had signed up for this. They were the leading tip of the vengeful spear of the United States Navy after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. Japan had not awakened a sleeping giant from its slumber, it had roused a superpower, and O'Kane was here to deliver its wrath. The radar man called out in a hushed but urgent tone, force of habit after so many undersea patrols evading enemy sonar. On a direct line from the underwater bridge to O'Kane up top, the executive officer relayed the radar man's contacts. "Boys, we've hit the motherlode. Bet it's a fat old convoy creeping along in the dark. What say we find out?" Over intercom, the crew was called to general quarters in anticipation of the attack. O'Kane had the cover of night. He'd launch an attack from the surface where the submarine was faster and more maneuverable. Besides, the suspected enemy convoy was heading into the mouth of the strait itself. The water was so shallow there was little point in submerging. 200 hours local. O'Kane's instincts had been right. Though he'd initially feared they'd accidentally misinterpreted Turnabout Island itself as a convoy, the radar contact had been so large. Heavily laden Japanese vessels moved slowly through the night. This was perfect as it allowed the Tang to get slightly out ahead of them as she made her approach. The convoy wasn't alone though. At the lead and the rear were 2 Japanese destroyers. They had not established a flank guard, leaving them exposed. Perhaps they thought no American submariner would be insane enough to attack this close to the shore. American submariners, however, were proving a different sort altogether. Their Pacific exploits would soon rival or even outshine those of German U-boats in the Atlantic. The Tang prowled alongside the convoy out of sight as O'Kane surveyed his prey through binoculars. The large escort made sense, and he couldn't help but whistle to himself in awe. They had struck gold. Japanese merchantmen accompanied several large tankers holding massive reserves of petroleum and fuel oils. These tankers had aircraft tied down to their decks, and it appeared as if several troop transports had been repurposed to carry more aircraft as well as crates full of supplies and equipment. Steaming south, he knew letting this convoy slip past would mean hell for the Marines and soldiers fighting across the southern Pacific. O'Kane knew it was a risky attack, but not attacking wasn't an option. The men inside the boat were already at battle stations, watertight doors sealing compartments off from each other in case of flooding. If they needed to crash, O'Kane and the few crew on the bridge with him would quickly scamper down the stairs into the watertight hull. The ships in the distance were easy prey for ambush, but targeting them would be different. They were running with almost no deck lighting for fear of exactly this type of attack. None could guess the success and the terrible cost the next few minutes would bring. The Tang's Mark 18 torpedoes were unguided, which meant that O'Kane had to work out an exact firing solution, taking into account his own speed, the torpedo speed, the distance to the target, and the speed of the target. It was complex math, and it had to be done quickly. In the 4-torpedo room, the torpedo men were already loading the heavy torpedoes into the firing tubes. One of them crossed himself superstitiously. The Mark 18s were known to leak hydrogen gas, a fire hazard, and potentially lethal in a submarine. America's entry into the Pacific War had come with some of the worst torpedoes of the war. The Mark 18 was an improvement, but a far cry from those used by her opponents. Part of the problem was a rush to produce the badly needed weapons, meaning that thousands of miles back home, there was little if any quality control being done on the manufacturing and the assembly of the torpedoes. Untrained workers had been rushed into the factories, forced to learn on the job with specialists stretched thin and far in between. None could guess the Tang had received one such bad torpedo with a simple defect that would spell out catastrophe. Searchlights blazed to life in the darkness, taking O'Kane by surprise as he peered through the binoculars. Morse code. The Japanese escort commander was signaling to his escorts. Some Japanese sonar man must have gotten a whiff of the Tang's presence, and now the escorts were suspicious. They began to fan out. Soon they would implement a large grid search. If their spotlights didn't find him, the radar soon would. O'Kane had to move fast, but the Japanese commander had just done him a massive favor. He belted out orders using the silhouette created by the Japanese searchlights to pick out his targets. The first was a huge 3-deck transport crammed with crates and aircraft, then a smaller transport between the 3-deck ship and a large tanker. That would be his third target. Ordering the helmsman to turn into the Japanese convoy, he gave the firing order. The expert crew rapidly carried out their orders, the Tang setting out 6 torpedoes in a rapid volley. The Tang immediately turned hard to port, putting her on a parallel track to the convoy as the torpedoes closed the distance to their targets. Massive flashes of light illuminated the dark night as one of the torpedoes struck home on the 3-deck transport. Seconds later, a second explosion brought the smaller transport to a standstill. O'Kane couldn't tell the fate of the tanker. He was too busy tracking the Japanese destroyers that were now moving in his direction, cued by the track of his torpedoes. From the stern torpedo room, the Tang launched 2 more torpedoes at a third transport as the aft torpedo room fired on a tanker. By now, the Japanese had tracked the wake of the torpedoes and had a rough idea of the Tang's location, the deck guns opening up as shells tore into the ocean above and around the submarine. It was time to get out. The Tang put on flank speed as 1,000 yards behind one of her transports exploded from a direct hit. A Japanese destroyer cut in between the tanker and the Tang had just fired at the submarine itself, inadvertently putting itself in the direct path of one of the incoming torpedoes. The warship shuddered in the water as the massive warhead ripped into the bow, flooding the fore section of the ship. A minute later, secondary explosions rang out as fire set off the destroyer's own complement of torpedoes. The ship would slip beneath the waves shortly after. O'Kane and his crew had sunk 7 ships. It was an incredible accomplishment, but the firing of Japanese deck guns was becoming ever more accurate by the second. The Tang was now in a mad dash away to the safety of the night, and O'Kane was heavily considering diving. The Japanese, however, suddenly shifted their fire away from the Tang. O'Kane realized that they were firing blindly into the night. This must have been an inexperienced crew, probably fresh from training. It explained why they were on escort duty here, where it was safer rather than in more dangerous waters. This gave the Tang an opportunity to finish the job. Fortune favored the bold, and America's Navy assigned its boldest officers to submarines for exactly this reason. The submarine turned hard to port, swinging her back around into the convoy. Taking advantage of the escort commander's poor judgment, the Tang made a beeline for the silhouette of a single troop transport. The heavily laden transport labored under full power, but hitting her would be child's play. Closing to 1,000 yards, O'Kane ordered 2 torpedoes to be loaded, the last of his load. No submariner liked returning to port with unfired torpedoes. It was a mark of shame amongst the silent service, and O'Kane was happy to put his remaining load to good use. At 900 yards, the Tang opened fire, the two torpedoes firing in rapid succession. The first ran straight and true, on a murderous course to intercept the Japanese transport, who had no idea it was still being targeted. But then it all went wrong. The sonar man was the first to spot the malfunction in the second Mark 18 torpedo, quickly followed by a crewman on the upper bridge. The torpedo had initially ran straight and true, putting 50 yards between itself and the Tang. Then, a minor defect in its gyroscope had sent its internal guidance spinning, forcing the torpedo into a tight arcing turn. And at the end of that turn was the Tang. The torpedo surfaced. "Sir, second torpedo, she's done a runaround." O'Kane looked up. Sure enough, he could spot the trail of the submarine as it cut through the dark water. Basic geometry allowed him to work out exactly where the endpoint of the torpedo's slow circle would end. "Flank speed left rudder now!" O'Kane screamed into the intercom. The helmsman threw the engines into maximum power as the plainsman jerked on his controls. After a few seconds, O'Kane's order came over the intercom again. "Starboard, full rudder!" O'Kane was trying to fishtail the Tang as he worked out the trajectory of the incoming torpedo. He cleared the body of the sub out of the way. Now he hoped to swing the rear out of the lethal turning radius of a rapidly closing torpedo. But it was too late. The Mark 18 was slower than the Mark 14 it was replacing, but even at 29 knots it could outrun the Tang in such a tight turn. The torpedo came within several feet of the rear of the Tang, its onboard systems detecting the magnetic signature of a metal hull. The 575-pound Torpex warhead exploded. A sledgehammer of water smashed into the aft torpedo room, instantly collapsing it and killing the men inside. The watertight door connecting the torpedo room to adjoining sections failed as the submarine structure collapsed, causing the onrushing water to compress the air in several compartments to several thousand atmospheres. This instantly incinerated the men within, turning them to ash as the superheated bubble burst open even more of the rear of the submarine. But the Tang had been designed to prevent complete failure of the boat in case of a disaster such as this, and the watertight doors held, sealing off the front half of the submarine. The force of the explosion, however, had thrown the entire boat forward violently. Several bridge crews suffered broken limbs as they were hurled into their equipment. Suddenly, the entire boat pitched upward, nearly completely vertical, throwing men and equipment around. One sailor fell from his post up near the front of the bridge, smashing into the superstructure and falling into the water, dead from the impact. The Tang's rear section was sinking. Emergency electrical power the only thing keeping the wreck lit, and its below-water crew from being caught in suffocating darkness. Up on top, though, O'Kane and several crew members were thrown into the ocean. One man hit the side of the sinking sub and was knocked unconscious. From the top of the conning tower, O'Kane spotted radio man Charles Andriolo, who'd been on lookout duty. The man yelled in panic as he clung to the sinking submarine, yelling he couldn't swim. Let go, and jump!" O'Kane was fighting to stay afloat himself in the turbulent water as he tried to encourage the radio man. But Andriolo was frozen. The panic of being stuck on a sinking submarine and the panic of being hurled into the ocean. How did a man who couldn't swim end up serving in the Navy and on a submarine, no less? Andriolo kept his grip on a piece of railing as the boat went vertical and finally slipped under the waves. Somewhere under the water, common sense or greater panic finally forced him to release his death grip. But by then it was too late. The submarine was giving off a violent churning of bubbles as it sank, making it impossible for the radio man to find purchase in the water and kick himself to the surface. Inside the submarine, watertight doors had prevented flooding from the explosion, but the hatch on the conning tower had never been closed in those final crucial moments. Now water flooded into the submarine. Panic-stricken men ran out to the main passageways of the boat in a bid to get to the escape locker in the forward torpedo room, only to be swept away by the violent surge. The force of the water pinned them against the walls and the watertight doors, helpless against the ever-increasing pressure as the submarine sank lower and lower. Well before the boat hit the bottom at 160 feet, most of the crew had already drowned. O'Kane bobbed on the surface, forcing himself to remain calm. Two other crewmen were floating nearby, and the three moved close to each other for mutual support. None had life jackets, but all were strong swimmers. In the dark, they could make out the location of the Tang from all the bubbles still breaching the surface, but the strong current was swiftly pushing them away. 0345 local. O'Kane could feel the explosions rather than hear them. Somewhere out there in the darkness, in the vicinity of the Tang's location, a Japanese destroyer was dropping depth charges. He tried to estimate the distance by measuring the force of the dull thumps his body felt under the water and guessed they must have been floating for several miles, far enough that he couldn't see the deck lighting off the offending destroyer. O'Kane seethed with rage. It wasn't bad enough that his submarine had managed to sink itself. Now the Japanese were purposefully depth-charging its location. Sonar men in the escort group couldn't possibly have missed the massive explosion from the torpedo, nor the cacophony made by the massive air bubbles released as the submarine sank. It was obvious that the Tang was dead below the waves, but the Japanese were depth-charging her anyway out of sheer spite. What O'Kane couldn't know was that deep beneath the waves, over a dozen of his men were still alive, crammed into the forward torpedo room. The Japanese depth charges had come close enough to set off a battery fire which was quickly filling the room with heat and smoke. The trapped men only had a single escape locker which could fit 3 at a time with which to exit the submarine. With the aid of the notorious Momsen Lung, a device that had killed more people in testing than it saved in the war, they'd have enough air to get to the surface. But the escape process was agonizingly slow. Flooding the escape trunk, exiting, and resetting it for the next group demanded precious minutes as the torpedo room turned into a sweltering inferno. The air grew toxic with fumes and the relentless heat claimed men as they collapsed unconscious. Eventually, one last sailor climbed into the trunk, his sweat-soaked hands trembling as the blistering heat made the paint on the ceiling bubble and broil. Of the 13 men who would escape from the USS Tang, some of the men would die in the ascent, succumbing to injuries or exhaustion, or asphyxiating on malfunctioning Momsen lungs. Some would be ignored by Japanese vessels and left to drown or die of hypothermia. Incredibly, one man would escape via the conning tower, using his pants as a flotation aid. 9 survivors in total would escape the Tang and live on to be rescued by the Japanese. After being hauled on board, the men were beaten by angry crew members from the ships that the Tang had just sunk, who had also been rescued by the Japanese destroyers. In the words of Captain O'Kane, when we realized that our clubbing and kickings were being administered by the burned, mutilated survivors of our handiwork, we found we could take it with less prejudice. The USS Tang's story is filled with bravery, tragedy, and incredible resilience. What moment from this submarine's history stands out the most to you? Let us know in the comments below. Now drown your boredom with "I was stuck underwater for 3 days," or click this other video instead.